of 4 luncheons on climate science and climate policy here in the state of Washington. My name is Daniel Malarkey, and I chair the Washington Clean Tech Alliance Government Affairs Committee, and I'm very happy to welcome you to what I think will be a fantastic luncheon and a great opportunity for all of us to learn more about the current and prospective policy environment here in the state of Washington for regulating carbon emissions. So, as I hope you all know, this is the second in 4 series. Our first luncheon on April 28th dug into what we know about climate science, the broad areas of agreement among climate scientists about how human activity is increasing the amount of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere and the impact that's having on global temperatures, and then how that is particularly being felt in our region, and what is known and unknown about our prospects for the future. I think that was informative, great discussion. Happy to see Cliff Mass here back for more as we move from the science into the policy to drive better decision making for our public leaders. So today we have a great panel that's, I could not ask for a more expert group of people to be addressing you here today about what is the current and prospective public policy frame for carbon regulation in Washington. And so let me just briefly describe them, introduce them to you, and then bring Ashley up. But before I do that, I do want to kind of highlight our final 2 luncheons, and then move over to introductions. So we sort of think the progress here is what do we know about climate science? How is climate change likely to impact our globe and our region? This luncheon is how do we understand what is the current and potential regulatory changes that could be coming down the pipe in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And the last 2 luncheons look at 2 different approaches to putting a price on carbon. So our next luncheon will look at the BC-style carbon tax. Our neighbors to the north have adopted a revenue-neutral carbon tax to reduce carbon emissions. And then the final luncheon will look at a cap-and-trade approach to basically looking at California. So we have a neighbor to the north that has done a carbon tax. We have a neighbor to the south that's done cap-and-trade. And so the goal is that by the end of this series that we'll all be a little bit smarter in terms of the science, the existing and prospective public policy context, and 2 important solutions to getting a price on carbon. So our panels today, as I mentioned, just could not be stronger. So they will be skillfully moderated by Ashley Ahearn, who covers environment, energy, and climate issues for KUOW. She's on the board of Environment Journalism, which is a group of journalists that really try to figure out how do they do a better job of covering environmental issues. And she's also part of a regional collaborative called EarthFix, which is a group of reporters across the Pacific Northwest. We're trying to figure out how do we take these complicated scientific issues that are driving public policy changes and get a broad cross-section of our population informed and able to participate on these important policy decisions. We're then going to hear, so Ashley's going to sort of quickly set the stage and then serve as our moderator, and then we're going to hear from Keith Phillips. Keith is the Governor's Environment and Climate Policy Advisor. I had the great fortune to work closely with Keith during the Governor Gregoire administration, and Keith is deeply involved in working now with Governor Inslee in developing and shaping climate policy here in the state of Washington, and could not, again, ask for a more informed participant in the statewide debate. And then Keith is so involved in these issues that he has to leave early and work with the governor on some important meetings with some important constituents. Maybe we'll tell you some more about that later. So he's going to go first, and then take a few questions, and then have to duck out earlier. And I know he's sorry to not be able to stay for the full conversation. And then Dennis McLerran, who was appointed by President Barack Obama to run our region's Office of the EPA, will be our second speaker. Dennis is a longtime public servant here in the Pacific Northwest. Before working at EPA, he ran the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency. Again, deep both knowledge in terms of the the science, the scientific challenges that we face in terms of maintaining good air quality in the region, and the appropriate public policy responses. So again, great panel. I'm going to turn it over here to Ashley to kind of set the stage from her perspective as an environmental reporter, and then we'll hear from Keith and Dennis. So thank you so much, and enjoy.
Oh, great to be here. See, full house. I want to talk a little bit about what I do in covering this stuff, because I think that covering climate change and climate action is one of the most important stories that I cover, and it is also one of the hardest. I have to tell you, in covering the Climate Legislative and Executive Work Group over the past year or so or more, I'm filing 1-minute radio stories, and I can see I'm working so hard on this language about a cap and trade versus a tax, and BC's done that, and California's done that, and my editor's eyes are just glazing over. He doesn't understand. I have to kind of argue with him about this being such an important story, and yes, it may seem like watching the sausage getting made and explaining sausage on the radio is not something any editor wants his reporter to come and tell him she needs to do that day. But there's no doubt in my mind that explaining the process is really key, and so it's great to be in a room full of people who care about the process and care about getting it right, especially my fellow panel members here. From my perspective, covering this, I really look at the outcomes. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change. Many of the people in this room are already following this closely and know about this. But I'm interviewing shellfish farmers who are seeing the impacts of lowering pH affecting the ability for their larvae to survive. Sea level rise, tribes in the Olympic Peninsula that are already having to move entire settlement areas, villages, to be out of harm's way. Fires, drought, and lastly, landslides. Heavier precipitation, intense bursts of precipitation are in line with the projections for climate change in this region, and we saw some of the heaviest precipitation in the lead up to the Oso landslide. So if anybody thinks that the impacts aren't real, that's my job, is to keep reminding people, hey, guess what? We're not screwing around. This is really happening, and it's going to cost us a lot of money. So, and Washington State has a long history of getting out front and trying to lead on this. I think that the political pushback has been intense, however. So I want to talk a little bit about, starting with the Western Climate Initiative, when the governors of California, Washington, Oregon were trying to get together, and Alaska, I believe as well, trying to get together and take some meaningful action on this, and it just sort of fizzled with the recession. It's a tough sell. It's a tough sell. But I think that with Climate Legislative and Executive Work Group, we saw, renewed enthusiasm, and everyone was saying, oh, good, now they're going to come out with something. They're going to pick a plan. The government's going to decide, are we going to do a cap and trade? Are we going to do a tax? They're getting bipartisan members on this panel. And then I called up one of the people on the panel, and she didn't believe that climate change was real. And at that moment, I kind of started scratching my head and saying, we can talk a lot about what's going on here, and we can form panels, and we can have conversations until we're blue in the face, but there needs to be some action happening. And I think it's no accident, and it's wonderful that Dennis McLerran is in this room, because I think that Governor Inslee and Barack Obama are in very similar roles. They're leading sort of parallel lives on the state and federal level, in the sense that President Obama in his first term couldn't pass climate action, climate change legislation. Governor Inslee has tried so hard and is running into so much opposition in the legislature to get anything meaningful done. KUOW didn't do what we hoped, many hoped it was going to accomplish. And so I think that, Gina McCarthy was in town last week, and I had the opportunity to sit down with her, and man, that lady is awesome. I'm a fellow Bostonian, so every time that woman says cabin, my heart just gets so happy, Because she gets it, right? Cabin, we gotta stop the cabin. And, she was hinting at what is going to be the big news next week. It is already kind of starting to be big news, which is an expected announcement from the Obama administration and from the EPA about using the Clean Air Act to help states take action. Basically, allowing Governor Inslee and folks like governors like Governor Inslee to call in the big dogs to help them get the action they see that they need on the state level. And so I'm really looking forward to having Dennis hopefully fill us in a little more about that, and Keith as well, in terms of what this means for Governor Inslee and what he hopes to accomplish. So, what Gina said to me is, her goal is not to preempt the governors, but to enable them. And I think that's what the Clean Air Act is going to allow them to do, and it'll be interesting to see more specifics. So now I want to hand it over. I don't want to take any more time. We're very limited on time. We have Keith only for a little bit, for about half an hour now. So let's have you come on up, and then we'll have some questions from the audience. I'll ask maybe one or two, and then we'll open it up as quickly as possible, and then we'll move on to Dennis. So thank you so much for being here.
afternoon. I'm not as loud as Ashley, sorry. Thank you. And by the way, clue is now a verb. I'll just let you decide how it gets used behind closed doors. Okay. Thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts, some information on where we're headed with the governor's office. I'm going to take a half step back, but very briefly, and go back to climate science or climate facts. So we have 3 recent reports that have been issued. I'm sure you've seen them all, that look at the status of knowledge on the causes, the impacts, and the implications of climate change. The University of Washington report in December, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel in March, and the U.S. Climate Assessment this month. They all take the same kind of crack at documenting changes in natural systems, temperature, hydrology, sea level, ocean conditions, both for the Pacific Northwest and for the globe. They also describe the impacts, both observed to date, as well as going forward, on water availability, drought frequency, hydropower production in the out years, implications to shoreline infrastructure and shoreline communities, forest mortality, and fire. They're documenting all this. But I think the newer part of the story that we're starting to see emerge is the implication of climate change to human systems. In particular, if you haven't looked at it, take a look at the United Nations report. What does it mean for agriculture and food supply? What does it mean for population displacement? What does it mean for public health? What about poverty and economic systems, territorial integrity, national security? They took an initial sort of scientist-eyed look at those kind of data. And they not only looked at the data and described them, but for every one of their conclusions, they characterized the data. Here's how confident we are, here's the weight of evidence and how much data, here's the probability or likelihood. And as a result, the UN report was a word-for-word consensus report. And the scientific consensus is actually stronger than it has been. I don't drag you back a meeting just to sort of make that point, even though I think it's fascinating. There's something in all 3 reports that is formative to the governor's thinking. And if you haven't considered it, I'd like to just sort of put it in front of you. If you take a look at all of the forecast models when they get summed up, it talks about where these changes and impacts are going. Not necessarily where we've been, but where we're headed. First, the daunting conclusion, with the amount of greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere and ocean today, things are going to get worse before they get better, regardless of what we do. So there's that fact to sort of think about. But the other important fact is, if you take the reasonable likely greenhouse gas emissions going forward, and you run all the 25 models, and you categorize it into 6, 7, or 8 possible scenarios, the reasonable worst and the reasonable best emission scenarios going forward start to diverge before the year 2050. And in the latter part of the century, they paint 2 different options for what kind of world you want to live in, or what kind of condition you want to have. So I think what that means is this: if we act now, we have the choice to head off the worst that climate change can bring. If you're willing to look long, if you're willing to think about it. If I act now, if Washington acts now, if the world acts now, I have a chance of making a difference by the time my kids consider retirement and my grandkids are looking at starting a family. And I got to tell you, that's incredibly important to the governor. So the choice that we have to make, I think that the report presents, isn't one of let's dismiss climate change or brace for some sort of doomsday scenario. I really think that's a false choice. It's one that maybe surfaces more often than it should. I think it's more a matter of, do we wait and see? Do we maybe hesitate? Do we wait until someone else has maybe come up with a solution, or the problems are more publicly evident and worth talking about? Maybe be afraid of wasting some energy? Or do we do the best we can to make a difference? Now, I know from the governor's perspective, he starts his family, with family, and then he thinks about his obligation to the state, and he's already made that choice. From his perspective, this is a matter of Washington doing what it does best. It's following the science, it's taking responsibility, it's taking action, and it's leading in order to make a difference. And if we act now, there are more choices. There are better choices we can make and opportunities to be had. If we wait, those choices become tougher. So as Ashley mentioned, we are not new to this challenge. In fact, in 2008, we enacted limits on our state greenhouse gas emissions for the years 2020, 2035, and 2050. However, and I was in the back room when this happened, I'm sorry to say, the bill to enact the implementing mechanism did not pass. Lots of yelling this week. I'll just figure it out. So we did not decide how we're going to get there. So in his first year, the governor convened a legislative work group to look at how far we've come, how far we have to go, and what else we need to do in order to make a difference, in order to meet those limits. So let me acknowledge that we've done a lot. There's quite a bit of work that's been done in the state. We buy cleaner cars in this state, and I might say thanks to Dennis in particular, we do that. We continuously build more efficient new buildings, and we have programs focused on retrofit of existing buildings. We're increasing the amount of renewable energy we use to produce electricity and focusing in on all cost-effective energy conservation as an explicit program. We are both producing and using renewable transportation fuels, and we have local governments who are national leaders in land use and transportation planning to reduce congestion, to improve transportation efficiency, reducing both costs and emissions. And as a result, Washington has some progress to show from it. If you look back 10 years plus, and you look at where we were headed in 2020, and you take all of the state and federal policies and put them all together, because they do interact with each other, you can't take them individually, we're a little better than halfway towards our 2020 goal, just in the last 10 years with everything we've put in place, if it plays out. If you look long-term, 2035 and 2050, we actually have some way to go. So one of the conclusions that the governor got from the KUOW process is we need additional action if we're going to meet our obligations. So what does that mean? In year one, the governor focused on rekindling the public and political discourse around climate change. And I would put it to you that, well, we may have hoped that the group would come to agreement and come up with a definitive plan. Really, the first year was about just that purpose, bringing climate change back into the public discourse so that this kind of conversation could happen. What do you want to do about it? What do you think we should do about it? And what proposals should be taking place? Year two, this year, for the governor, is very much doing our homework. He wants a set of policies and programs for additional actions designed to work in Washington. He wants us to crunch the numbers for Washington. And he wants us to engage the folks who are either affected or are willing to help. And that's part of the reason I'm here, is to encourage you to step in and help where you can. In April, a lot of you have seen it, the governor issued an executive order with sort of just that purpose in mind. Let me walk you through the 6 things he's hoping to accomplish with that executive order. And it's all in the area of designing proposals for additional action to get at our obligation. So first, he convened the Carbon Emissions Reduction Task Force, and he asked it to recommend to him, how do I make these state limits actionable, and how do I engage the market in finding the most cost-effective solutions? What are the market mechanisms I should be looking at? So he doesn't say cap and trade or carbon tax. He says, I want a cap or a binding limit or some sort of actionable, enforceable, we're going to get there, signal to the market, so you create a supply and demand. And then he's open to whether it's trading, carbon taxes or fees, or incentives, or some combination of market mechanisms that will send the signal in combination with that, here's the number we have to hit, mark. And you'll all hear more about that from others in the next session. He intends to take the advice of this task force and submit legislation to the 2015 legislature to enact a carbon market program for Washington. So that's what he's bringing. Second, he's asked the state agencies to work with key electric utilities to negotiate an end to the use of coal-fired electricity in our state. And it's pretty clear, we don't use coal for a lot of our electricity. It's a fairly small portion of our electrical use, but it's by far the largest carbon footprint we have in that particular sector. And we have cleaner, affordable, and reliable alternatives. And probably even more fortunately, we have utility leaders who are already actively involved in this transition, because they see the economic writing on the wall, they see the opportunity, they would like some help to get there in terms of a transition that doesn't create rate shock or shareholder shock, and we're very fortunate to have those leaders in the state. Third, the governor has asked state agencies to step up with several programs designed at reducing emissions in the transportation sector. Incentives and infrastructure for electric vehicles. Another fresh look at zero-emission vehicle requirements, just because Dennis couldn't get it done last time. I'm trying this time. A grant program for local governments to help them with their transportation efficiency programs, because efficiency in transportation reduces emissions. And the preparation of a state multimodal plan that provides design or objectives and a framework for all these little pilots we have out there on demand management and transit-oriented development, all these programs that are sort of aimed at the same objective, but put a framework around it that says, our objective here is moving goods and people for least cost, least emissions, least energy. And that's the framework he'd like to see us improve on over time. In the clean transportation arena, the governor has also asked his Office of Financial Management to take a hard look at the technical feasibility, the policy, and the economics of a low carbon or clean fuel standard for Washington. And I need to be very clear about this in particular, given the noise that's going on out there. The governor has directed a technical and economic evaluation. He has not made a decision on whether he's going to propose clean fuel standards. The state does have, through the State Clean Air Act, the authority to propose something, but in his view, it's one step at a time. We need to do this evaluation. You all need to see it. We all need to see it and consider it before we talk about next steps. We have looked at what others have costed it out to be previously, other jurisdictions, the advocates and the opponents. It's somewhere between $7 a gallon saving and $2 a gallon cost. In other words, we can't really rely on that information. In his view, he wants, in Washington, our refineries, our businesses, our fuel use, what do the numbers look like? And what can we do about those numbers? He's not interested in jamming folks at the gas pump, and he's not going to do that, and he's not assuming we can gain tremendous amounts of money by doing this. This is a matter of finding a rational approach. But to be clear, the governor has never endorsed a particular proposal, and you can't cost out what you haven't endorsed. And anyone that says otherwise is speculating. That's probably too strong of a word for this forum, but anyway. Fourth, the governor has asked his agencies to put together a program to further leverage investment in clean technology. Development, R&D, demonstration, and early deployment in particular. He talks about the dog food industry and the video game industry and all the R&D we put in, all the money we put into R&D there, and how we're not doing what we need to do on clean technology. Because in his view, we don't have the tools yet to completely succeed at tackling climate change, and we need to invest in that area. And if we do it, it helps our economy, it keeps our competitive edge sharp. He's hoping to build on the Clean Energy Fund, his $40 million program he has in play currently, and make it a more permanent, ongoing venture. In addition, he has asked WSU to lead an effort to put together a piece of legislation on extending and improving our solar energy program going forward for the 2015 session. Fifth, the governor has asked that we take another look at energy efficiency in buildings. A lot have been there, done that for a lot of folks in the crowd and for Washington in particular. We have a great track record to build on, but in his view, we're still not getting out of that what we could in terms of emission reductions and jobs and savings. And the idea here is just take a few tools, on-bill financing, point-of-sale energy disclosure information, a better accreditation system, a better definition of what's cost-effective and what's not, package it up and put it into a statewide advertising campaign, statewide program, brand that says to businesses and homeowners, here, we're going to make it easy for you. CEOs, leaders, and others are saving money. Why aren't you? Homeowners are doing the right thing. Don't you appreciate the cultural value of saving energy to the state? And put that forward so that businesses and homeowners at least have an additional opportunity to take advantage of how to save money and reduce emissions. He's also asked WSU to put together a program to look at how to help farmers and industries reduce their energy use and increase their productivity. It's a popular program. We just haven't invested in it much. When you look at energy savings that are possible out there, industry and agriculture have big numbers you can work with as compared to homeowners and others. And sixth and final, the governor has asked state agencies to lead by example. How do we cut emissions without cutting state services? The state buys a lot of cars. The state buys electricity, runs a lot of buildings, especially when we include our universities and college campuses. So how does the state engage the market and try to buy at scale and try to help the market improve products over time? For each of these efforts, the governor's asked to look at the costs and benefits, and I gotta emphasize, this is about Washington programs, Washington numbers, and if the numbers don't come out right, is there anything we can do to the proposal to deal with unintended and unacceptable consequences before we put it forward for review? That means we'll look at the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions, we'll look at net gains and losses, but it also means we need to look at market shifts, job winners and job losers, leakage. We need to look at cost containment, and we need to look at mitigation for those who are disproportionately exposed. Energy intense, export exposed businesses, small businesses, low-income communities, those are things he wants us to take a look at. He did that while he was in Congress. He was very proud of what he was able to do in terms of getting that kind of mitigation in the federal bill that passed the House, and he wants to do that here. And just can't emphasize this enough, he has a background in economics. So for him, it's not just a matter of, darn, I gotta check the economics cost-benefit box before I can do anything. For him, the economics are another reason for acting. The state has a record of proven innovation. He believes the state can develop the tools the rest of the world will need. So he's looking for the economics to help identify where we can maximize the benefits and help keep our community strong going forward. This is why you use staples. So by the end of the year, the Carbon Task Force recommendations are due in November. So that'll give the governor a month to put his proposal together for the legislature. The Clean Fuel Standard Technical Evaluation, Economic Evaluation is due in September. That'll start the discussion and the debate around that. And except for the transportation planning, which will probably take 2 years, all the rest of what I mentioned will turn into a set of formal proposals from the administration. That'll go out to public review, or to the legislature, or to both. Now let me end with answering a question the governor gets very frequently. Why should Washington do this? Why does climate action in Washington make any difference at the global scale? The governor usually brings up 4 specific reasons for what motivates him to ask Washington to do this. First, he says, look around you. Look at the water supply, look at the forests, look at our marine waters, look at some of our industries that are dependent on that. Washington has a lot at stake, and it's appropriate for us to act to prevent further harm. Second, he says, look at the economic opportunities. We already have the data on salaries. We already are seeing the numbers and growth despite the recession. And those who lead, who can bring technologies to scale and bring down the cost, have a greater opportunity to benefit from the transition. Third, if we do something and the nations don't do anything, we won't succeed. So if states, provinces, subnational governments can show the nations and the world that you can do this without harming your economy, without lowering your quality of life, that gives them extra protection. So when the president and the governor talk, they talk about how to cover each other's flank. They talk about encouraging each other. And they know when one acts, it provides opportunity for the other. And I think that's true going into New York and Peru later this year and going into Paris next year, where they're focusing on subnational encouragement of international action. And last, but important to the governor, we're only 1/3, Washington is only 1/3 of 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. But the flip side of that is a sense of 100% obligation to do what we can for ourselves and for our children. So here's the summary. The governor is compelled by the climate facts. He is confident that we can tackle this in a way that captures market opportunities and preserves economic health. And he is absolutely committed to doing this to protect our state and future generations. And we're looking for any partners. We're looking for folks to help improve this. A lot of folks are interested for various reasons. But if any of you are, definitely like to hear from you. I want to apologize for leaving earlier, but I hope that my absence will give you a degree of freedom, so you can sort of talk about it. I'd like to cede my time to Dennis, who's been doing this before and after, and I would encourage you to have him debate himself. He's very good at it. In independence, though, I would like to be available to you, actually, in opportunity. I'd like to be available to you as the Alliance and the Chamber sees fit, and they know where I live, so please take me up on that. Thank you.
So we still have 10 minutes with you before you have to run? Yeah? Don't sneak away so fast. Yeah, let's have Dennis up. Because what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about authority now. It's one thing to enact a lot of energy efficiency, fuel standards, things like that on the state level. I kind of see those as the foothills on the way up to Mount Baker, with Mount Baker being the ultimate in a cap and trade or a tax or a real plan policy on that front. Do you see what I mean? So how do you, it feels good to hike the smaller ones, but let's talk about Mount Baker. How is the governor, what happens if his group presents this legislation in 2015 and it doesn't pass? Then what?
Well, the governor's been doing this for 20 years. So if he's told no again, it's probably several thousand on his board about it's too hard, it's too difficult, can't do it now. I don't expect him to give up, so I'll start there. What options exist depends on how it goes. You've got to play to win, as they say in the legislature. It's a long session. There'll be a lot of discussion, potential for overtime given the state budget. And I think he intends to bring it and ask folks to stand up and be counted on it. What happens if they can't get there for whatever reason? Probably means what are our next options after that. And we'll decide that after the session's over.
Is the possibility of a ballot initiative?
There are folks out there who've worked on ballot initiatives for years, and the governor's been pretty clear. He supports any and all our forms of government. It's his role, however, to work with the legislature.
Can you weigh in on that, Dennis, and talk a little bit about how much power and how the EPA may or may not support the governor in that effort?
Well, if I tell you too much about 111D, which is coming out in a week or so, I won't be the regional administrator any longer. But I will say that what we're trying to do at EPA for state governors around the country is create a framework that compels action, that does say, at least for the electricity sector, that people are in every state are going to have a target and they're going to have to develop plans. And those plans will have to achieve those targets. And so that means that in a very flexible way, in a very a way that recognizes what people have already done, people are going to have to take action under the Clean Air Act. And the electricity sector is not economy-wide by any means, but it is certainly an important sector. So more to come on that soon, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in my prepared remarks, but good things are coming.
And I might just add that Dennis had to go to extraordinary efforts to get approval to participate on the governor's carbon task force. So we very much appreciate that. We're not necessarily getting the president's vote right there in the task force, but we're getting a representative who has a lot of knowledge to contribute in that. The governor's very appreciative of that.
I'd really like, there are a lot of smart people in this room that probably have some great questions, so I would love to open it up now while we have Keith here. Anybody want to ask a question? Say your name first.
My name's Tim Farrell from Forterra. Go to the flip side of this. Many of you know that I've also been in the port industry in my past, and we look very hard at mitigation. Which we're going to have to do no matter what. We can't get far enough out ahead of this thing if we won't have to mitigate. What's the governor thinking about in terms of mitigation?
So first, in climate jargon, you have to realize that some people mean mitigation when they say mitigation, other people mean adaptation. Talk about prevention, I assume you mean problem here today, what do we do about it to live with it, right? The so-called adaptation side of this, or mitigating the immediate impacts going forward.
Yeah.
Well, here's the story. The president rolls out his climate action plan, and we're pouring through it trying to figure out what the role of governors is. Climate resiliency and adaptation. Governors are going to create this group, and they're going to go tell us how to make communities stronger and ready for the impacts that are happening. So we said, Governor, you ought to get in on this, because no, I don't do that. You should, because adaptation is here now. It's a real problem, helps out. He goes, there are other governors out there who are going to figure out how to put a seawall around Manhattan Island. My job is to look past that and to keep people focused on making sure the seawall doesn't have to get any higher. Now, some other governor, we still haven't found him or her to beat on them, put his name in the hat. The president pulled it out of the hat and put him on the task force anyway. So we sent him to DC for the first task force meeting, and we said, okay, Governor, there's some twofers here. Who had their lights on first after Sandy? The folks with solar power. If you don't burn the forest and you keep it healthy, you can reduce CO2 emissions from forest fires. Well, and we gave him 3 or 4 of those, so for his talking points. And he got partway through the first one and said, but you all ought to be focused on the long term. You ought to be doing mitigation, because otherwise the problem's only going to get worse and you're going to have to go back and redo that seawall. So he's very passionate about taking the long-term look, which is very unusual for a politician. He deals with a lot of people who are going, I got 2 sessions to get this done or I'm going to be unelected, and then I got other things to do with my life. He's going to constantly take the long-term look, take the global look. It isn't just about Washington, it's about the tropics and the Arctic and about our kids. And for that perspective, part of Chris's new job there is adaptation is a good thing to do. We are going to do it. He's fully supportive of what the shellfish industry is doing, what the cities are doing with infrastructure, what the forest folks are doing. It's just not his passion.
Could I just add to that, we at EPA are very concerned both about the mitigation side, the long-term side, but also the adaptation side, and see the adaptation side as really a sort of fundamental government responsibility. It's what people expect their government to do: protect their infrastructure, make sure that we're aware of what it means to have higher sea level and increasing storm effects. Hurricane Sandy, if that was not a wake-up call for every local government around the country, it should have been. And we invest a tremendous amount of federal dollars in that clean water infrastructure, in the sewage treatment plants, in the plants that provide clean water and so on. And everyone, and a lot of the focus on this is really at the local government level, because they're the ones that operate those services, that put that maintain the roads, maintain the seawalls, that protect our ports and so on. That work is very much work that needs to be done. The good news is people have been working on that for quite a while. Our water utilities in the state, our hydropower providers, have been focused on this for about a decade and have had working groups that are really looking hard at what this means in terms of that side of it. I think the local government and the county government level are coming on board with this. Dow Constantine and others really know that people expect their government to step up and be aware and do the things that are needed to protect that infrastructure, because, as Keith said earlier, we bought, at least 50 years of change, and no matter what we do on the mitigation side, there's a lot of adaptation work that we have to do, and they go hand in hand. And without visionaries looking at the mitigation side to take us through the long term, we're going to have a lot more adaptation to do. So the challenge here is to do both and do it well.
Just one point of emphasis. Last week, you may have missed it in case you did, Farmers Insurance sued a bunch of local governments in the Chicago area for all the flood damages they paid from last year based on inadequate storm systems. And the premise of the lawsuit against these local governments was they had the data, climate change was real, they knew the numbers were there, and they didn't do anything, and we're being asked to pay for it. So this is a fascinating conversation. Local governments who are leaders